Hi guys, welcome back to your video collection. Instead of making two separate videos for the stuff for that was supposed to go out on Thursday and Friday, I'm just going to make it into one video for you guys. Um, and there you go. If you are watching this video, good. A lot of the stuff from it is going to be reflected in your quiz and test. In fact, if you don't watch these videos, it is going to be difficult for you when it comes to your quiz or test. So just keep that in mind as we move forward. So these sections deal with the following. The focus is mostly on the sixth and ninth commandment, as well as the virtues of chastity, purity, and modesty. When we look at the sixth and ninth commandment, right, they are related. They're not the same thing. The one that when we look at them, they focus on external actions and internal actions. Um, the sixth commandment teaches you shall not commit adultery, so it's an external action. The ninth commandment, you shall not covet your neighbor's wife. That's an internal feeling. That is an internal action that you do have control over. Again, I'm not kind of contradicting anything when I say that thoughts in and of themselves are not necessarily sinful, but when we choose to dwell on thoughts, and that's what covetousness is, that's where it does become sinful. So when we look at these commandments, they are teaching us that there are internal actions as well as external actions that can be sinful. So, in the sixth and ninth commandments are rooted safeguards for chaste living, that is, for living a life of chastity, for people inside and outside the covenant of marriage, right? The sixth and ninth commandments apply to married and unmarried people alike. Marriage is presented as the only proper context or relationship in which both the procreative and unitive purposes of sexual intercourse can be rightly realized. When we look at them, it's essentially just teaching us that sex is meant for those that are married. Um, Regarding marriage, as Catholics, we believe that the marriage covenant is lifelong, faithful, and holy. So when we look at the purposes of marriage, which is on page 219 in your textbook, two purposes of marriage, right? I'm actually going to read it really quickly. The sharing of love between the spouses, right, which we would call sharing, right, unitive, right, the unitive purpose. And then the second one, the transmission of life, right, the procreative. So the two purposes of marriage, unitive and procreative, okay? Um, in terms of kind of part of marriage as well, um, one of the major gifts is referred to as fecundity, which is a vocab word. But I'm going to tell you right now, fecundity is something that we've talked about before. We call it marital fidelity, right? It is that ability to be completely open and honest with your spouse. It's part of the unitive aspect or unitive purpose of marriage. That complete gift of self to other is the complete gift of faith of self, faith that you will be faithful. Okay, so fidelity is another way of describing. Um, Sorry, scratch that. Fecundity, wrong. Fidelity. I don't know why I was saying fecundity, although I'll get to fecundity in a second. So fidelity is related to the unitive aspect, that ability to give yourself completely to your spouse and be faithful to them. Fecundity is with the procreative aspect. Fecundity is the ability to produce life with your spouse, that is to have children. So two great gifts, right, that go with the two purposes of marriage. In terms of what you receive through the sacrament of marriage, hopefully the giftedness of fidelity and fecundity. So, as far as it goes, we have to understand that when we look at marriage, and we have already, that there are some things that we need to be aware of. Marriage, again, when we look at it, is meant to be, and when we talk about purposes, we also have to talk about the two, um, the two, not purposes. That's unitive and procreative. The two Oh man, I'm drawing a blank right now. Give me a second. My brain will start to function here. The two. Let me look at this other notes I have over here. Sometimes my brain don't work. Properties. Wow. Two properties. That is the two things that marriage possesses that make it marriage, and they are indissolubility and exclusivity. Wow, I am struggling today. Uh, Indissolubility and exclusivity. That is exclusivity, one man, one woman. So it's exclusive between those two parts, right? Those two people that make up the marriage. And indissoluble, that it is a lifelong commitment, that it lasts as long as one of the parties is alive. Okay. Uh, Sorry, as long as both parties are alive, then they're married. Okay. So when we talk about offenses against marriage, we're talking about things like adultery, divorce, polygamy, incest, free union, and these are all things that we've talked about before. So none of this stuff should be really kind of new to you, but I'll just quickly go through it. Adultery is an offense against the bond or the property of exclusivity, right? You're bringing a third party or more into a marriage that is meant for two. When we look at divorce, that is a violation or offense against the indissolubility, the fact that it is meant to be lifelong and cannot be broken by man. Polygamy, again, violates exclusivity. You're bringing in, again, a third or fourth partner into the, or more, into the marital relationship, which is a violation of exclusivity. When you look at incest, it is sexual intimacy between relatives or in-laws within a degree that prohibits marriage. So means aunt, uncle, cousin, first cousin, child, brother, sister, etc. And we talked about those. And if you want to look at some of those kind of rules that the church lays out for you, it is in your sacraments textbook. I'm not going to get too far into that. But it is a violation of the exclusivity part of marriage. And then finally, we have free unions. Now, I gave you two different kind of names to look at when we talked about free unions. Free unions are relationships that are like marriage in that people live together, but they in fact are not married. So we talked about things like, I'm trying to remember what we called them in the sacraments textbook. When we talked about free union, we talked about trial marriage. We talked about, what was the other one that we talked about? I don't remember, and that's okay. But when we talk about free marriage, it's basically talking about people that are living together. I think we called it cohabitation. Man, my brain not working today. Cohabitation, living with somebody outside of the bonds of marriage, but acting as though you are married. And then there is trial marriage, in which you have an intention to perhaps be married one day, but you want to live together and figure out if it'll work first. And of course, we know the statistics for both of them show that doing that is not good for actually having a marriage, that those people that live together before they're married, in fact, have a much lower percentage of successful marriages. All right, so that was very quickly going through the stuff of the 6th and 9th commandment portion of this video. I'm going to quickly go over your questions and answers for your Unit 8 questions, and then we'll get into chastity, purity, and modesty. So question number 1 for today: what are the 6th and 9th commandments, and what virtues do they commend to us? 6th commandment teaches us you shall not commit adultery. The 9th commandment is you shall not covet your neighbor's wife. And they encourage the practice of virtues that help us respect our sexuality and that of others, i.e. chastity, fidelity, fecundity, etc. The second question: why does God intend why does God intend for men and women to express the full sexual commitment through intercourse only in marriage? It's because it represents a married couple's relationship. In the intimate act of sexual sharing, a husband and wife give themselves totally and exclusively to each other. That full gift of self to other is only possible with the understanding that that person is going to be with you forever, right? For life anyway. Number 3, define each of the following: adultery, divorce, polygamy, incest, and sexual abuse. I'll just very quickly do that. Adultery, sexual relations with someone other than your spouse, or can also be an unmarried person with a married person. Divorce is the dissolution of the marriage contract, civil dissolution, and of course that's not possible in terms of the sacramental aspect of it. Next one, polygamy is having more than one spouse. Incest is engaging in sexual intimacy with a relative or in-law. Sexual abuse is an outrageous and unjustifiable moral evil and criminal act that harms children physically, emotionally, spiritually, etc. It is just an egregious violation of not just the 6th and 9th commandment, but oftentimes it is rape, which is a violation of the 5th commandment as well. You are not looking at the person as a person. You're not treating them with the dignity that they deserve as a person. The 4th question asks about free unions again. Why are free unions and trial marriages wrong in the eyes of God? Free unions and trial marriages are insincere attempts to play at marriage. They destroy the very idea of what marriage is and family, and weaken the virtue of fidelity, of faithfulness. The 5th question: what are 2 purposes of sexual intercourse in marriage? And we talked about those. The sharing of love between spouses, i.e. the unitive purpose, and the transmission of life, i.e. the procreative purpose. The 6th question: why does the church condemn contraceptive practices? And we've talked a lot about this one already. When we talk about artificial contraception, the real reason that it's so offensive is that you are closing yourself off to one of the purposes of marriage and sexual intercourse within marriage, which is the procreative aspect. And again, I would say that it also shuts you off to the unitive aspect of, well, you are not giving the complete gift of self to other if you are physically, chemically, whatever, cutting yourself off from them. You're holding something back. Okay. And then the 7th question: do parents have the right to limit the size of families? If yes, under what conditions? And we have talked a lot about natural family planning, so if you need to refamiliarize yourself with it, please feel free to look at the videos. I will make them available to you if they are not already available to you on the website. But for moral and unselfish reasons, things like the current size of the family being as large as they can afford and kind of live and not go into a zone where they are making it dangerous for themselves, financial hardship, psychological, physical health, all those things are legitimate reasons why a husband and wife can and should limit the size of their family. And as long as they use natural family planning methods in terms of moral and reasonable practices, and when I say moral and reasonable, they need to be both moral and reasonable practices. They are well within their rights to limit the size of their family. And then number 8, lists several unacceptable methods to treat infertility in a married couple who wish to conceive a child. Explain why these means are gravely disordered. We're talking about things like in vivo and in vitro fertilization, which is kind of what we call test tube babies. We're talking about things like reproductive cloning. Basically, any time where we thwart the purpose of the marital act, which is two becoming one, the procreative act, it is going to be problematic. So if you have frozen embryos, things where the embryo, what we know happens after conception when a person's life begins, where they're harvesting them, they're freezing them, sometimes killing them, etc., that's problematic. So selling of human eggs, the ovum of a female, sperm donation, surrogate motherhood, test tube babies, other similar procedures are all morally unacceptable because they separate the act of lovemaking from the act of procreation. Okay? All right. I'm going to pause here. All right, back. Sorry, bathroom break. Um, Chastity, purity, and modesty. Um, so these are the virtues that we can use, we can develop. They are all related to the cardinal virtue of temperance, right? And as with all the cardinal virtues, they are ones that we can build up on our own. And they're very important in terms of living out and expressing the gift of sexuality that we've all been given in a moral way. Um, and they're difficult. They're difficult in the world that we live in. Um, we live in a culture that's hypersexualized. I mean, there's no getting around that reality. And you guys know, you guys live the world that we live in. Um, it's very much a world that says if you're not having sex with somebody, there's something wrong with you. And of course, that's not true. And I think we have to kind of realize that reality. There are people that out there that put out stuff because it helps them to kind of assuage their own feelings of guilt, the pangs that they have for the stuff that they do, right? And so we have to understand that not having sex is okay, right? In fact, it's more than okay. It's good for most of us, and even for someone who is married, not having sex is good at times, right? There are appropriate times and inappropriate times for even married people to be having sex. So when we talk about chastity, purity, and modesty, every person, right, is called to develop and work on these virtues. Excuse me while I move here for a second. Oh. And they're really helpful in terms of becoming who you are. So when we look at each of them, it's important to understand what they're asking us to do. So we'll talk with chastity first because modesty and purity kind of help us to be chaste. Chastity does not mean not having sex, right? Let me be clear on that. It can mean that, right? But chastity really means living the gift of sexuality appropriate to your station in life, appropriate to who you are. And when we talk about chastity, as a chaste husband, as a chaste married person, for me, it means I have to be sensitive to how I relate to my wife, not just sexually, but also as a human being, right? Particularly sensitive to her as my spouse. But it does mean, obviously, that sexual relations, marital relations, conjugal relations, however you want to express it, are exclusive to her. And then outside of that, people who are not married, chastity does mean not having sex, right? And I think sometimes we look at that as a lack in our lives. But here's the thing: you are not doing something, right? If you're not doing something, it is something that, you're not doing it. It doesn't mean you're missing it, right? I think sometimes we look at our lives like, okay, I should be doing everything. And basically that's a wrong way to look at your life, right? Life is full of stuff that we need to do to live, but there is stuff in there that we can do that is good for us, and there's stuff that we can do that's not good for us. And both of those things are stuff that we don't necessarily need to do, okay? So chastity kind of really comes to us from the reality that as single people, for everybody that I'm talking to right now, it means you are going to be doing stuff to help you live out that gift of sexuality, which means it means things like practicing abstinence, right? Obviously that is like first and foremost, not engaging it, but also building up related virtues like modesty and purity. And in the world that we live in, again, it can be difficult, right? Learning to command, right? Or to, and when I say command, I think sometimes that has a negative connotation, but to control our sexual desires, right? And use them appropriately to who we are is not impossible, right? Difficult, but not impossible. And so there are some things that we can do to help build up that great virtue of chastity. Avoiding situations, avoiding temptations, avoiding situations that put us into temptation. Getting to know ourselves a little bit better. I think one of the biggest problems that most teenagers have, I know I certainly did when I was a teenager, is actually knowing myself and knowing those things that trigger me, knowing those things that are going to tempt me, right? And not just necessarily about sex, but all aspects of my life, things that tempt me to do stuff that's not good for me, right? Practicing self-control. And obviously, this is, when we talk about chastity, it's related to sex, but practicing self-control in all areas of your life. Like, some people have, like buy everything that they can. Well, maybe not buying stuff, right? Practicing in small ways those things that you're able to control to build up an overall habit of self-control is a very good practice for life. Self-denial, practicing all of the moral virtues or cardinal virtues, prudence, temperance, fortitude. What's the fourth one? I'm not actually forgetting it. I'm just, putting it out there. There's a fourth one. I don't know why I'm expecting an answer right now. Prudence, temperance, fortitude, and justice, which we're really going to get into in the next chapter, although justice is related to all these as well. When we look at, actually, let me let you know a secret here. All the stuff that we talk about as far as the Ten Commandments, we really are talking about all four of these cardinal virtues together, right? Really looking at the Ten Commandments and kind of keeping them in the forefront of your mind and living them out is a way to help build up the strength and the virtue of chastity. Praying, right? Praying is super important. Having that line of communication open up with your Creator is very powerful, right? And just saying stuff, verbalizing either out loud or mentally verbalizing the stuff that's going on in your mind and heart is really important. Like, God, please help me too. God, I love you. I need your strength for ... right? Not just in the areas of sex, but like in all parts of our lives. That is such an important aspect that I don't think enough of us pay attention to. Be prayerful, right? All right. Modesty and purity. Purity is sometimes referred to as purity of heart. The virtues of purity and modesty help us to combat lust. Right? Lust is a disordered craving for sexual pleasure. And it's disordered because it is leading us away from goodness, from God. Right? That's why lust is disordered. Lust is not always sinful. Right? Actually, it is always sinful. I'm wrong. Right? But sometimes we confuse lust and desire. Right? Desire is sometimes good, but desire turned into lust is bad, right? And when we talk about lust, what makes it disordered is craving for sexual pleasure in and of itself, right? When we talk about sexual pleasure, it is a side benefit of the actual intentions of sexual relationship, which is the unitive and procreative aspect with your spouse, right? If sex is merely about pleasure, it's wrong, right? That's just the bare facts of it. As far as what we have been created to be by God, sex should be pleasurable with your spouse when you are open to the unitive and procreative aspects of it. No getting around that, right? But if you are engaging in sex purely for pleasure, it is by its very nature disordered, right? It is by that understanding of it disordered and going to lead you into sinful action, okay? So when we look at purity, right, purity of heart is kind of the anti-lust, if you will. And it's not merely about sex. Purity of heart is a desire, again, using that word, to do the right thing all the time, right? Particularly in the area of sex, but really all parts of our lives. And that's something you can, again, pray for. Ask God to help me desire that which is good for me, right? Those things that are good for me in relationship with you, relationship with the people around me, right? That's actually what purity of heart is, and it's a super important virtue, right? It is related to chastity, but it is not necessarily exclusively about it, and it's really related to and strongly rooted in temperance, as all these are. Okay, and the last one, modesty, is obviously respecting your own sexuality, particularly in terms of what you say, how you look, right, and really in terms of how you approach relationship, right? Modesty is really being respectful of your sexuality, your own sexuality, and the sexuality of others. And it's an important one to develop. And when I talk about living in kind of a sex-focused, a sex-crazed world, a big part of that is the lack of modesty that we see around us, and perhaps even when we look in the mirror, right? The human body is objectively beautiful, right? It is an amazing thing, but it is not necessarily something that is meant to be shared with everyone, right? And when we look at modesty, it protects the intimate center of who you are, right? You should always be able to share yourself with other people, but there are aspects of yourself that are important to remain mysterious, right? Now, having said that, when it comes to modesty and when it comes to mystery, right? God is the ultimate mystery, right? God is the mystery that we will forever be being kind of unraveled and trying to know more throughout the entirety of our existence in heaven, right? And here. But that begins here, right? I've known Mrs. Motley for over 20 years now, right? And she is still a mystery to me. And I'm sure I am a mystery to her in some ways as well. And getting to know that mystery more intimately, deeper, is part of who we are. And it is only possible because of the gift of modesty, right? It's not that we don't share ourselves with the other, because we do. It's just there's so much to be revealed, so much to know about this other person. And so modesty is going to be a part of who you are, hopefully, because there's so much more to you than this, right? The corpus, there is this whole part of you that is to be revealed, right? And the corpus part is a mystery that should be, not shared with everyone either. And that's okay. All right. So let's take a look at these last kind of 4 questions for this video. I know it's been a pretty long one. Thank you for sticking with it. And again, let me just underscore for those of you that are here that watching this is going to be very beneficial to you. And I'm telling you now, if you're watching this video, that I am going to make the next quiz a little bit more difficult. The test is going to be more difficult because some of you who don't do well on quizzes and tests, who are now miraculously getting like hundreds and stuff, that tells me that you guys are not doing the work that you need to do in terms of watching this stuff. So now you're going to need to watch this stuff to do well. Question 1. What are some attitudes towards sex proposed by a playboy, playgirl mentality? We wouldn't necessarily use the term playboy or playgirl. We'd use like words that are not nice, like slut, like f-boy, etc. That's what we're talking about here. I know they use some kind of antiquated language for this one, but that type of mentality ignores both of the aims of sexual activity, right? When we look at people who have those type of mentalities, that sex is something, is a tool to be used, right, for yourself or to control others, that's problematic, right? And people who have that mentality think of pregnancy as something to be avoided, and love is unnecessary, right? If you're avoiding pregnancy, you should not be having sex, right? If you think love is unnecessary to make love, you are wrong, okay? These people who have this mentality are the ones who live the understanding of life that we would call Epicureanism, right? Do it if it feels good. That's false, right? Feeling good is good in its proper context, okay? Life is meant to be good, right? And it's always best in its proper context. And I think we lose sight of that sometimes. Second question, what is the virtue of chastity? Discuss several ways we can strengthen this virtue. I actually answered that one already, but chastity is a virtue that helps us to control our sexual desire and use that desire appropriately according to our situation or station in life. Example, married, single, religious, ordained, right? Ways to strengthen the virtue include avoiding temptations, as I said earlier, knowing ourselves, practicing works of self-control, self-denial, practicing the moral virtues, striving to live God's commandments, praying for God's grace, going to, and I didn't mention this one, but it seems self-explanatory, but in the world we're living where it's not available, like receiving the sacraments of the Eucharist and reconciliation are really helpful. And using and receiving them as frequently as you're able to. The third, what is lust and how does purity of heart help control this vice? It is a vice. It is the disordered craving for enjoyment of sexual pleasure sought in and solely for itself, right? It's, again, going back to that mentality that I talked about in the previous, not previous, but the previous question, isolated from God's intention for sexual relationship, unitive, procreative. Purity of heart means wanting to do the right thing at all times, right? Not only in the areas of sex, but in all parts of our lives, and asking for God's assistance in doing it. The fourth and last question before we wrap it up, modesty. Describe what it means to be a modest person in the area of sexuality. Means being respectful of our own sexuality and others' sexuality. We should be patient in our relationship with other people, decent in the clothing that we wear, and very careful in the way that we speak about sex and sexuality. All of these things are important in terms of us being who God has created us to be, and very worthwhile endeavors in terms of developing now as you're younger, so that as you get older, you have a better chance of actually living out who God is asking you to be. So that's all we got for today. I will see you guys on Monday with the last video for this section, and your quiz will be on Wednesday. Have a good day. Bye.